Hi folks, welcome back to the channel. If you're new here, my name's Ben and this is my Camera Basics series. This is episode 4 where we're going to be looking at Aperture, what it is, how it works and how it affects your images. Before we get into it, I am so sorry this has taken so long to get out there, but we're here now, so let's get on with it. So in previous episodes we've looked at light and exposure, shutter speed and ISO. If you're a complete beginner, I would recommend clicking the button up here to go to my playlist for the Camera Basics series, and that'll take you right from the start so that you're up to speed for this episode. I'll also leave a link down in the description. So, aperture. This is the third and final element of the exposure triangle, which is what determines our overall exposure when taking a photograph. Unlike shutter speed and ISO, aperture is a characteristic of the camera lens rather than the camera body. To best describe aperture, I'll be referring a lot to these eyes. Much like the eye, a camera lens has circular elements within the lens barrel. Because we shoot in all sorts of lighting conditions, a lens also has a disc of metal blades which open and close to allow more or less light into the camera. This is called the aperture diaphragm. What we call the aperture is actually the hole in the middle of the lens, much like the pupil. That's right, the empty space is the aperture, not the discs themselves. This is a pretty common misconception. Even looking at my old business logo, you can see that I used aperture blades as part of the logo, and then where you can see the mountains in the middle, that would be our aperture. Much like shutter speed and ISO, aperture determines how much light can pass through the lens to hit the camera sensor. The wider the hole, the more light can enter. The smaller the hole, the less light can enter. That's the easy bit. Aperture, again, is also measured in stops, more commonly known as f-stops when we're talking about aperture. Aperture gets a bit more confusing when we start looking at the numbers, the f-stop values. Shutter speed and ISO are relatively easy to understand. In shutter speed, it's fairly common sense that a 1,000th of a second is a faster shutter speed than a 100th of a second. And the same with ISO. ISO 800 is logically higher than ISO 100. Aperture, however. Some of the most common full stop values for aperture include f2, f2.8, f4, f5.6, f8, f11, f16 and f22. Just like the other elements, to move up or down one stop, we have to double or halve our f value. This makes far less sense with aperture because f2 to f2.8 is one stop, where you would think that f2 to f4 would be one stop. Nope. You'd also be forgiven for thinking that a bigger f-stop, such as f22, would be letting more light into the camera. That's not the case. An aperture like f2 is a very wide aperture, which lets more light in. An aperture of f22 is a tiny little pinhole, which lets barely any light into the camera. Confused yet? In simple terms, the smaller the f-stop, the wider the aperture is. And the larger the f-stop, the smaller the aperture is. This is far easier to demonstrate on an older lens, such as this. This is my old Pentax 50mm M series lens. It has a nice wide aperture of f1.7, so that's even wider than f2. This was originally made back in the 1970s, and just like any lens from that era, there was no automation in terms of cameras. Everything was done manually. So you'll see, as well as the manual focus ring, we also have a manual aperture ring. It's pretty satisfying. This has always been the case with cinema lenses, where smooth focus transitions are really important, and it's again becoming more and more popular with hybrid camera lenses for stills and video, such as the Sony 24mm G Master and the new 20mm f1.8. So on this lens, when we have it out at f1.7, you can see just how wide the aperture is. Then as we stop down, you'll actually see those metal blades starting to close down, making the hole in the middle smaller and smaller until we have a tiny little pinhole. That is your aperture diaphragm, and that is how we control aperture. On any lens that you buy, or you're thinking of buying, you'll see some numbers, usually on the barrel itself, around the front element, or both. These will tell you the focal length of your lens. This is the angle of view, such as a 50mm or a 28mm, and the aperture of the lens, such as 1 to 1.7, i.e. 1.7, or 2 for f2. This tells you the widest maximum aperture of your lens, and in some instances you'll also see the minimum focus distance of the lens. This is usually in meters or feet, or both. For some reason, no two companies can agree on a simple way of showing this information, but it's all there. This can be very useful information to know before you've even bought a lens. Say for example you want to do a lot of photography in low light conditions, then a lens with a wider maximum aperture will allow you to gather more light while taking the shot, giving you a faster shutter speed. Or if you like to do some macro photography, then the minimum focus distance might be an important factor for you. But generally speaking, bear in mind that a wider aperture lens will generally cost a lot more money than the same focal length with a not so wide maximum aperture. Have a look at the Canon 50mm lenses for example. So, aperture regulates how much light can enter your camera, just like shutter speed and ISO. Between the three of them, they determine the overall exposure of your image. But just like shutter speed and ISO, aperture also has its own unique characteristics which can alter your images for better or for worse. That being depth of field. Depth of field is pretty easy to understand. It's the distance between the nearest and furthest points within your image that are in focus, i.e. the amount of your image in front of and behind your subject which is also in focus. I'm not going to go into the physics behind it, but very simply, the wider your aperture, i.e. the smaller your f-stop, the shallower the depth of field will be in your images, i.e. less of your image will be in sharp focus. The narrower the aperture, i.e. the larger the f-stop, the deeper the depth of field will be, i.e. more of your image will be in sharp focus. By way of example, let's have a look at this shot of our friendly neighbourhood clown, Arthur. So, in this first shot we can clearly see Arthur in the right third of the frame, and as you can see, everything behind him and everything in front of him is way out of focus. This is a very shallow depth of field. And then as we move through these images, we go to f2. You may not have noticed much of a change there, but between f1.8 and f2 there is a slight difference in depth of field. Then now we'll carry on in full stops onto f2.8. You can see everything's a bit more in focus. f4, again, even more stuff in focus. f5.6, more in focus again. f8, and we can quite clearly see Bruce now in the foreground. Onto f11, and you can just about make out the yellow submarine in the background. Then f16, and finally f22. And now, quite clearly, almost everything within the frame is in focus to a degree. Even if you can't read the writing on any boxes, you can still see that it's a box with writing on it, as opposed to the f1.8 shot where it's just a white blur. So depth of field can be a very useful tool when you want to get a bit more creative with your shots, and especially with a shallow depth of field if you want to draw attention to your subject. Okay, so there's one other characteristic about aperture changes that I forgot to mention when I was recording, and that is solar flares and sun stars. So I've got a couple of clips here to demonstrate what I mean. Let's jump in. This first one is shot at f2.8, so quite a wide aperture, and you can see how blown out the sun looks, and you get quite a bit of flaring as well, which can be used to your advantage if that's what you want. And then compare that to this one at f22. See that sunburst there? When you close down your aperture, that's the kind of flaring you can expect. It can be a really cool effect depending on what you're going for in your images or in your video. So yeah, that's just another characteristic of aperture changes. And that's as far as we're going in this episode. So we've covered light and exposure and all three elements of the exposure triangle: shutter speed, ISO and aperture. If you're learning photography and you're following these tutorials, I would love to see what you're taking from these videos. If you'd like to show any of your work at all, feel free to email me. My email address is on my channel somewhere, or even message me on Instagram or something. Then I'd be more than happy to take a look, see what I think. We will be continuing with this series. There is far more to photography than just the technical essentials. It depends on your subject, on the weather, on the lighting, all sorts. And of course, what you actually want to get from your image. Bear in mind, photography is completely subjective. If people don't like it, but you do, who cares? So I'll leave it there for this episode. Thank you very much for watching. I really do hope that you're learning from these videos. If you have any more questions, do feel free to drop a comment down below and I'll be sure to answer. If you liked the video, do please give it a like, and if you want to see more, hit subscribe in the bottom corner down there with the notification bell so that you're told when I post new videos. And with that, until next time, be good, get out there shooting, practicing what you're learning, and I'll see you in the next video.